Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Montesquieu Forum. Several of you here today are from our class in philosophy and film. Some of you are former students. Kevin Lloyd, philosophy major we haven't seen in a long time. The prodigal son returns. And Kathleen Thomason, one of our very best students as well, who is a great maker of baklava and of ideas, and faculty members from other institutions. It's terrific to have you here. And also let me single out one individual in particular, in part to embarrass him. My friend Al Harris is here, who is an attorney from Chicago, and Al has provided funding for the Montesquieu Forum and allows for events such as this to take place. So thank you very much. Our topic today is the 19th century German philosopher Hegel. Our speaker is Professor Robert Berman from Xavier University in Louisiana. He has been working on Hegel and other things for, I think, some 40 years.
Far too long.
Far too long. Some of you have read Hegel. Wait, a more accurate description. Some of you have tried to read Hegel. I know of no one, literally no one, and this is not hyperbole, who has the capacity to articulate what Hegel is doing in a way that gets at the heart of Hegel without cheapening him, without bowdlerizing him, than Professor Berman. He engages in a kind of sophisticated, philosophical, prestidigitation, magic, in bringing Hegel to the surface that is really quite stunning. Professor Berman received his undergraduate degree from the University of Colorado. He went there initially to study astronomy, and he wound up studying philosophy. Those of the undergraduates among you who are studying something other than philosophy should Amber, are you listening to this? Thank you. Should learn a lesson from this. He received his PhD from the New School for Social Research in New York, where he wrote his dissertation not once, but twice. His dissertation is on the subject of, and you'll correct me if I get the title wrong, categorical justification. Categorical justification. You weren't supposed to correct me. Normative argumentation in Hegel's practical philosophy. And the dissertation was written in the early 1980s, and he left it at a carrel at a desk in the Tulane University Library, and it was stolen. So he had to rewrite it again. And he rewrote it and finished it in August of 1982 and defended the dissertation in 1983. Many people thought highly of it. He sent it to State University of New York Press. The press sent it out to 4 readers, all of whom sent back glowing reports and said, "This is a book you must publish." They announced this to Professor Berman, and Professor Berman looked at the readers' reports from different professors and said, "They don't understand the book." And therefore decided that he wasn't going to allow them to publish the book. And the world still awaits this publication.
This is my version of Samizdat.
Professor Berman's dissertation has made the underground circles in intellectual life in the way that Bob Dylan's 1964 bootleg tapes have made the rounds. Today, Professor Berman will be talking to us about Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, the nerve of the argument. Please join me in giving a great welcome to Professor Berman.
So thank you very much. Stuart, thank you for your warm and generous invitation and introduction. I think I'll sit, although at some point I may jump up. The fact that this is subtitled "The Nerve of the Argument," given that in about 30 minutes or so I'm going to lay out what I think the argument of the phenomenology of spirit is a book of over 500 pages. And as everybody knows who's ever opened it, as you said, people try to read it. I could imagine somebody saying the nerve of you, rather than the nerve of the argument should be the title of this talk. Anyway, so be it. So the handout that everybody should have a copy of is in 3 steps or 3 parts. There's a very brief intro, but the 3 main parts, I'm trying to motivate the argument that I think Hegel comes to make in this book. Let me also say just at the outset that I'm restricting my remarks to this book, although during Q&A, if we want to expand beyond this book, that's fine with me. But what I say about this book, The Phenomenology of Spirit of 1807, I don't want you to think that what I say about the argument in this book automatically transfers to the other 3 books that Hegel published in his lifetime. A book on logic that came a few years later, a book on political philosophy, the philosophy of right, and then finally his encyclopedia of philosophy. So what I do first is try to say what I think motivates the argument of this long book. I then, secondly, try to state the conclusions of the argument, and then I circle back and spend most of the time trying to state what I think the reasons are that get him to those conclusions that he arrives at. So you might think that's a little odd, stating conclusions first and then the supporting reasons for them, but I think it's good to get a sense of why he's doing what he's doing and where he thinks he ends up before stating how he thinks he's gotten there. So that's the way in which I'll present it. And a book of 500 pages, a book so rich in content, means that there are a whole lot of things that you may be familiar with from your own reading that I'm not going to be speaking about directly, and so maybe during Q&A, things that you have on your mind that I haven't spoken about and probably should have, you'll have a chance to take those up. So, so I want to say that there is a unitary argument to this book. That's simply an assumption that I'm making. Not all readers would agree, but you'll just have to leave it as a conditional statement. If there is an underlying single thread of argument through the book, then the question actually is, what is that argument? So just take that antecedent of that conditional for granted. I think that if you want to understand the argument, you need to understand that Hegel is accepting the idea that there is a crisis in philosophy. And I had put at the top of this, of the first page, some alternative titles, and I did that because some of you may have different backgrounds, and so different titles might speak to some of you rather than the others. But you notice in one of those, the word Kantian is mentioned, and so some of you will recognize that famous, very short paragraph from the beginning of Kant's 1785 Prolegomena. Hegel's taking that seriously. There's a big discrepancy between the advances that people find that have been made in mathematical physics on the one hand, and philosophy on the other. Philosophy is mired in intractable disagreement. The very skeptical philosophers are concluding that that's symptomatic of impossibility. And so the idea is that there needs to be, once and for all, an investigation to determine once and for all whether philosophy, or at least what philosophy aspires to, is even possible. And you can call this what philosophy aims to accomplish. I mean, definitionally, the love of wisdom. And so what is wisdom? One name is first philosophy. Another name is metaphysics. And Hegel is taking seriously the call to ask this question: is the wisdom that philosophy desires to attain even possible? And for a long time, I thought of Hegel's phenomenology as being his version of philosopher as Quixote. And I recently read a review of a new book on Cervantes' great novel. And in the review, Brookhiser, the reviewer, refers to Chesterton's poem, Lepanto, about Don Quixote. And so I stole from Brookhiser's citation from the Chesterton poem, "The knight rides forever in vain." So if you like that Quixote illusion, you'll like that title. So here's the question. If we're going to have a definitive investigation of whether metaphysics or first philosophy is even possible, then how is it to be carried out without engaging in the very thing that's under investigation? Philosophers know this as the problem of begging the question, a petitio principi problem. But it's clear that it would make no sense to carry out an investigation of the possibility of metaphysics that would itself be an instance of metaphysics. And so if the investigation is even going to get off the ground and not short circuit right at the outset, then it's got to be a non-metaphysical investigation of metaphysics. And Hegel proposes what he calls a phenomenology of spirit to do just this, to carry out a non-metaphysical inquiry into the possibility of metaphysics. So, and the philosopher who aims to establish metaphysics under the assumption it is possible and hence can be actualized, Hegel gives a name to this philosopher. He calls the philosopher consciousness. So throughout the book, whenever Hegel is talking about consciousness, he's talking about more than just what we mean when we use the word to mean something like being awake or being aware. And of course, that's part of the story. After all, the philosopher had better be awake, right? At least sometimes. Yeah. Although whether in believing that he can attain metaphysics, maybe he's dreaming after all, that's the question. But there's more to consciousness, as Hegel's using the term throughout, than just this ordinary understanding of consciousness. So for him, it's the descriptive name for the protagonist, the philosopher, whose quest for metaphysics, for wisdom in this sense, is under scrutiny. And if you look at the handout number 3, the resolution, so the way in which the crisis of philosophy is to be resolved is in this way, a non-metaphysical investigation of the prospects of the philosopher seeking metaphysical knowledge. And I've got those 5 points. I don't need to go through them all in any detail. You can see them. But these 5, I think, capture descriptively what it is that the phenomenologist, from his non-transcendental point of view, is observing. So what he's observing is the philosopher who's going to fashion his own criterion of success. So he's going to introduce his own conception of what it would be actually to have this kind of wisdom. He's going to assess or evaluate himself rather than having somebody else do it for him, not to mention have someone else be the one to supply the standard, because someone who would do that would be just another contestant, you might say, for the same throne of metaphysics. And there's some further details, but to remain resolutely non-metaphysical in the inquiry means to leave it up to the philosopher under scrutiny to supply all that he needs in order that the assessment in the end be a self-assessment in accord with the standards of assessment that the philosopher will supply himself. You know? So, if you were a Leninist, you would say, yeah, I understand what it means to supply the rope that they can hang themselves on. Yeah, that's by analogy, that's the idea. And if you can see just below that, where I state the main conclusions of this very long, detailed, richly contented book, 4 main conclusions that I think Hegel arrives at. First and foremost, a vindication of philosophic skepticism about metaphysics. So the upshot, first and foremost, is the conclusion that the metaphysical quest is unattainable. Secondly, however, is very important. It's also a way of vindicating philosophy as a non-metaphysical enterprise. Because without this turn to phenomenology, without philosophy becoming phenomenological so that it can examine, without begging the question, the prospects of metaphysics, the conclusion would not be possible. No conclusion would be possible to arrive at. And so, to the extent that a conclusion can be arrived at, it's a vindication of philosophy as non-metaphysical phenomenology, as Hegel understands it. Thirdly, I think, against the philosophic skeptic who might think that if it's true that, as Hegel purportedly has shown, that metaphysics is in principle unattainable, then that should allow the more radical conclusion that philosophy is impossible. And the Hegelian response to that is not so fast, skeptic. Just because it's true that metaphysics has been shown to be impossible, that doesn't mean that philosophy itself has been shown to be a quixotic enterprise as well. To the contrary, in fact, it's a vindication of philosophy as non-metaphysical, and therefore it puts a limit on what a philosophic skeptic could hope to conclude. And finally, I think, and this I think especially important for the Hegel who continues to write and think and publish and teach beyond the phenomenology and its results, the upshot of the phenomenology is that it opens up a new path for philosophy, he thinks, beyond phenomenology, but without backsliding into metaphysics. And so the conception of philosophy as a system of science that Hegel had actually outlined in a book form, he never got to fill it out, went through a few editions until his death in 1831. The idea of a system of philosophy should be understood as requiring a phenomenological introduction. So for you Kantians, the phenomenology is Hegel's prolegomena, but not to any future metaphysics that could come forward as science. That's the long title of Kant's prolegomena, but rather of a system of science that could come forward non-metaphysically. And so what is that? Well, that's the title of another talk that I'm not going to give. All right, so now hopefully without having taken too long, I've now stated what I take to be the rationale that leads Hegel to his 1807 phenomenology. His conclusions, both the immediate conclusion regarding the subject under scrutiny, right, the philosopher as the aspirate metaphysician, consciousness, and the further conclusion. So what is the argument that leads Hegel in his phenomenology to these conclusions? That's really That's the real question. Yeah. So let's see if we can't get a handle. And again, I'm very aware that I've got a lot of nerve trying to do something like this, but it's too late for that. It's Stuart's fault. He invited me. All right. So what is the nerve of the argument anyway? I say the following. If you look at the table of contents, and I'm just going to pass this around. You can look at it if you'd like, or pass it on. It's just a copy of the table of contents of the book. There are 8 chapters. Those chapters get distributed across 3 main parts of the book. First part called consciousness, the second self-consciousness, the third is called reason. And the long part of the book is devoted to the third part, reason. The first part of the book, called consciousness, is actually relatively short. In a book a little over 500 pages, by the time you get to about page 104, you've already finished the whole of the first of the 3 parts. And by the time you get through the second part, part B, called self-conscious, you haven't gone more than about another 30, 40 pages. The whole rest of the book is devoted to reason. So I say the argument falls into these 2 unequal segments. I call the one the short arguments, that's a shocker, and the other the long argument, even more shocking to call it that. What's he doing in the short argument? He's really doing 2 things. Consciousness operates with a very deep assumption that never is questioned. And this is in my number 2 at the very bottom of your first page. And I'll just mention that there's a word that's left out. That's my mistake. I just noticed it a few hours ago, where it says in that second line, to the philosopher, the unquestioned. It should say the unquestioned assumption. Yeah, so if you want to write that in. So there's this deep assumption that is a structural assumption, namely that knowing, the nature of knowing generally, is of an object, and the object of knowing is independent of and indifferent to its relation to knowing, whereas the knower essentially is in relation to its object. The object is only contingently related to its object, to the knower. It can be without being known. That's a deep assumption. I'm just calling it the principle of realism. And so consciousness, that is the philosopher, seeking to attain metaphysics, is understood by the phenomenologist, the non-metaphysical philosopher, as operating with this deep assumption. And a lot follows from this very quickly. So what is it to know specifically? The philosopher adopts the traditional understanding of knowledge that goes back, some of you will know this, to Plato's Theaetetus, if not before that, but we had that as a canonical text. The idea that knowledge consists not merely in true belief, but in true belief that is justified. And the philosopher has adopted this understanding of knowledge. And so its standard of success that it has imposed upon itself is that the measure that it's going to use to assess itself is it the case that I not only have a true belief about that mind-independent reality that I claim that I have knowledge of? Is it the case that I not only have a true belief, which means that my representation of reality accurately depicts reality, it's an accurate representation of reality, but I have evidence that my representation does just that. It's not that somebody else from the outside is in a position to say about my representation of reality, that's an accurate representation that he has, unbeknownst to him. That won't do. It's got to be from the inside. Because after all, he himself is the one who is claiming to be a knower. And to be a knower, he says, is not just accurately to depict reality as it really is, apart from its being depicted, but the one representing reality actually has all the evidence he needs to determine that his representation is accurate. And that means that the philosopher has to do more than just have a representation of reality. He has to assess it, and that means he has to engage in a reflection on himself. And so his conception of knowledge immediately, because it makes use of this traditional idea of knowledge as justified true belief, and justification requires evidence, and that evidence has to be accessible to the philosopher himself. His conception of knowledge, his standard of success, builds in self-knowledge, because he got to know about himself that he has what he claims to have. All right. Now, part A of the book, the first 3 of the 8 chapters of the book, under the heading consciousness. So consciousness as consciousness, you might say. Very quickly, in these 3 short chapters, consciousness reveals to himself that he's failed to attain what he has set out to attain for one very, very simple reason. And here, of course, I'm boiling things down, right? Clearly. We can talk more, if you'd like, about each of these chapters, if any of them are of interest. But I think the bottom line, as we say these days, is the following. What he quickly realizes, the philosopher, he realizes that his own understanding of what it is to know requires that he form representations. And that means that all that he really ever can say that he knows is the content of his representations. That the reality that he claims to know is, in the end, a construct of his own making, a theoretical construct. It's no accident that chapter 3, the culminating chapter of the first part, any reader would recognize as, in effect, what a mathematical physicist is doing in theorizing about reality, constructing a theory, in which claims about the lawful character of nature are proposed, and so on. But what really makes an impression on this philosopher consciousness is that his attempt to know reality always brings him up against nothing more than his own construction of reality. And Hegel thinks that what this means is that it's now natural for the philosopher to announce that his understanding of what he's aiming to achieve, namely knowledge, is really more narrowly to be understood as a quest for self-knowledge. And so we get part B. Again, not shockingly titled Self-Consciousness. And for those of you who are familiar with the very famous discussion in the Phenomenology of the Lord-servant relation, sometimes known as the master-slave relation, or the Lord-bondsman relation, it's sometimes translated, became very, very important and influential to readers of this book, starting with Karl Marx as a young 20-ish guy in the mid-1840s. That all takes place, that discussion takes place in part B of the book. Why doesn't the book end there? After all, it looks as if the philosophers had an insight that knowledge has really got to be self-knowledge. And part B is all about self-consciousness. Why isn't self-knowledge achieved under the heading self-consciousness? And there's a very simple, again, boiling things down. The last part of part B is titled The Unhappy Consciousness. Why is he so unhappy? Yeah, he's so unhappy because in the shape of self-consciousness, the philosopher has failed to attain self-knowledge. Why? For a very simple reason. Because on the one hand, he's claiming the object to be known is himself. There isn't anything other than the knower. Yeah? And yet, on the other hand, he's constantly having to acknowledge, given his commitment to the structure of consciousness, namely knowing is always knowing of that which is other than and independent of knowing and the knower, that there's no way to eliminate the otherness of the object, hence the unhappiness of the philosopher at the end of part B, and hence the reason to move to reason, the third part, the long segment of the full argument. Part B then is what I call the pivotal link, because it links the long argument that follows to the short argument that has led to it. The short argument led to, if there's going to be knowledge, it's got to be self-knowledge. The long argument now is the effort the philosopher is going to make beyond the confines of self-consciousness to actually establish self-knowledge without running into the difficulty that masters run into in relation to their slaves, or lords to their servants, or unhappy consciousnesses who are never quite able to overcome this difference that they believe ought not to be at all. One interesting, hopeful thing that this otherwise purely unhappy consciousness experiences at the end of part B is the following. He encounters someone who is said to be serving. And what is this server doing? Who does the server serve? What's interesting about this servant is that he embodies an individual who fully represents a perspective that is itself not confined, not parochial, not particular, but universal in perspective. And that supplies the bridge to the third and long part of the argument, to reason. Now consciousness, in this new guise of reason, in effect picks himself up and says, I now know how to do this. He introduces a principle that's going to guide him from this point forward. Those of you who had a chance to, if you've never looked at the table of contents before, you've now had a chance to look at it, you'll notice that Part C, the third and last part of the book, divides into these four subsections: AA, BB, CC, and finally DD. And that's all about reason. The principle that guides consciousness as reason throughout is what Hegel calls the principle of idealism. The principle of idealism is the certainty of being all reality. Now think about that, right? You first realize it's you, not something else, which is the reality that you seek to know, that turn to self-knowledge. But you then run into this difficulty that if there are other selves, then how can it be that my knowledge of myself encompasses all reality? As reason, that is the principle. That reality and self are the same. That's the principle. And now the only question left is this: what does reality have to look like? What does the self have to look like so that knowing as self-knowing can be the knowing of the self as all reality? It's that simple. Yeah? That's the task. That's all the philosopher now has to figure out how to accomplish. What kind of self and what kind of reality are such that in knowing the one, knowing it is sufficient for knowing the other because there's no difference. Yeah? AA, BB, BB with the famous title Spirit, C with the title Morality, CC with the title Religion, are all successive attempts on the part of the philosopher seeking to establish metaphysical knowledge, to attain it in the form of a knowing of the self, which is all reality. So, why the failure to achieve it in those ways? Now, the first thing that consciousness realizes, being a very sensible philosopher, is, and having learned from the failure of self-consciousness, that the object of knowledge has got to be another self. After all, if it's going to be self-knowledge, the object has to be the self, whatever the self turns out to be. That's the question. And that means that knowledge as self-knowledge has to take the form of what in my handout I call very broadly a social relation. And therefore it's no accident at all that already Hegel had by anticipation introduced into his book the word that he's most famous for, that single word, spirit, the German Geist. And how does he define spirit or Geist in the Phenomenology? He states the following: the I, first person singular pronoun, the I that is we, first person plural pronoun, and the we that is I. The I that is we, the we that is I. If I can find a way to establish that I am a member of a we, and we are all I's of the same we, and if that's reality, then in knowing one another, I achieve the very kind of knowledge that I've set out to achieve. So that's the strategy. And Hegel considers, broadly speaking again, three different kinds of sociality, or if you'd like, three different kinds of community, three different kinds of ways in which an I can be a we and a we can be an I. And they all fail. They all fail. And some of these in his text have become very famous. Many people know of his account of what he calls absolute freedom and terror. What's he doing there in that discussion of absolute freedom and terror? Some will remember very vividly the way in which Hegel adapts Sophocles' Antigone to account for the conflict that Antigone confronts with Creon, and the conflict between the human law of the political community and the divine law of the family. In effect, two communities at odds with one another. He also discusses what it is to be a member of a socioeconomic form of social reality. So to be a member of a free market, to have social status over against being a citizen of a polity, not to mention being a member of a family. Absolute freedom and terror is the attempt to avoid all the conflicts that arise from diverse identities that are functions of being members of these different communities, these different forms of sociality. There shall not be family. There shall not be a market economy. There shall not be anything other than the one political community. And we won't even allow that to have specific political institutions, because that would reopen a diversity that would belie the unitary identity of the self and the unitary character of the reality that should be the reality of the self. And of course, that is such a mark of failure that the philosopher, in effect, concludes, if I'm going to find the I that is we and the we that is I had better get beyond political reality altogether to a reality, the kingdom of moral ends, in which membership does not require membership in a family, membership in a particular form of society or culture, because morality transcends all of that, except for one problem with the moral community, and that's the following. The moral community makes no room for those who are immoral. But religious community does. We forgive all sins, even the sins of morality. Yeah? And so it looks as if finally, this is now chapter 7, part C, CC, religion. This is it. I've arrived, says the philosopher, except for one final problem. Yes, there is a human being who incarnates the successful metaphysician, God. God is, or we should say, to be more careful, says the philosopher, was once amongst us. And we, the members of the community of the faithful, can aspire to be what we know a human being can be, namely God. Because after all, he was once among us, the perfect metaphysician, the one who knows all reality, knows himself to be all reality, and therefore the one who, not accidentally, is said to be omniscient. To really have the knowledge that the philosopher seeks, the truly wise one. And yet the problem for the religious community is that there remains, unfortunately, this distance. First of all, understood as a temporal distance, right? God has died. Right before Nietzsche, Hegel says in 1807, God is dead. But we, the community of the faithful, aspire through our religious practice to make ourselves into the one who once was amongst us. But that remains a hope, and nothing more than a hope for a future which will remain a future forever. And so Hegel ends not with chapter 7, but with the final chapter 8, titled Absolute Knowing, which is not a knowing of the absolute, but rather a very different kind of knowing. And a very different kind because it's not the kind of knowing that had been presumed possible by the philosopher who's been examined throughout, but rather what Hegel calls the knowing that comes with recollection. The German Erinnerung, literally the making inward. What has been made inward? What has been made inward is the course of the entire history of consciousness as it has attempted, unfortunately without success, to achieve metaphysical knowledge. And it is not just a remembering, but an etiological diagnostic understanding of the causes of the failure. And if Hegel is right in his claim that this array of attempts is finite and all of the attempts that have been made exhaust the available options, there's a finality, yeah? It's no accident that at the very end of the book, the very last page, Hegel invokes the image of Golgotha And absolute knowing is the philosopher, as it were, looking back on his life as an aspirant to metaphysics, the death of the metaphysical enterprise, and his convergence with the perspective of the non-metaphysical phenomenologist who's written this book. And that's the end of the book. That's the end of the argument. That's the end of my discussion.
Thank you very much. Quick comments, questions, considerations?
Yeah.
I'm interested in talking about knowledge and recollection and
Yes.
recollection.
Yes.
In Plato's Meno,
Yes.
he defines as an image of knowledge as recollection. I noticed a few other references to Plato throughout.
Yes.
Especially, I was thinking that Socrates claims that he is the wisest of the Greeks because he knows nothing.
Right.
And
Yes.
that puts him at the stage of the unhappy self-consciousness.
Yeah.
Could you go a little further into
Yeah, sure.
how historically the recollection?
Yeah. Couple things that I think are worth noting in light of your question. I think it's an important question. If you look back at my alternative titles at the top, you'll notice that one of them says Kantian-Socratic. And the reason I think that this is both a Kantian and a Socratic enterprise that Hegel has undertaken, and here I would want to say that the famous Socratic formula that he gives to the jury in the Apology, in interpreting what apparently Chaerephon heard from the oracle, right? Chaerephon, of course, not being around to verify that, but his brother's there, right? Nobody is wiser than Socrates. Well, that can't be right. You know, that puts me at odds with the oracle and by implication with God. But of course, God never says what's not true, so there must be an interpretation, given the principle of charity, that would render what the oracle says, what I know to be true about myself. I can't be mistaken about myself. What do I know about myself? I know that I know nothing, right? And so that's human wisdom. And I think that there are two ways in which Hegel's phenomenological, non-metaphysical enterprise is Socratic in this sense. First, that it takes the form, by analogy, with a kind of Socratic, maieutic, for those of you who are familiar with the midwife analogy, also an image from the Theaetetus as well. Socrates himself is not the one who's going to be making the big knowledge claims. Remember Thrasymachus in the Republic, those who are familiar with it, complains, Socrates, you always get off easy, you ask all the questions, you get everybody else to do the answering, right? So I think it's Socratic in that sense, right? The burden is on the interlocutor, in this case, the fictional construct of the philosopher of consciousness. He's going to supply all the rope to hang himself on. But I think it's also Socratic in that there's a kind of culminating knowledge of ignorance, because consciousness through the recollection is coming to understand that he doesn't know, if by knowledge we mean what he had meant originally, metaphysical knowledge, right? He does not have and cannot have the kind of knowledge that, if it can be, is not available to a human being, but only to a God, right? And that's the force of this way of thinking about the incarnation in chapter 7, next to last chapter. And that brings us to recollection. So the knowledge of ignorance takes the form of, because after all, he's really saying, I know. I don't just think I don't know. I know that I don't. How do I know that I don't know? Because I really do have a diagnostic understanding of the failure of all of these attempts to achieve it. So it's not just that I have a true belief, right? I really have all the evidence I need. Namely, this series of failures which exhausts all the possible options available to the metaphysician or to the would-be metaphysician. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah.
Yeah. How would you? I want to know how you would interpret the beautiful soul section toward the end of the book, and how it fits into.
Yeah.
The
No, that's
schema
very
you
good. That's very
provided.
good. So, first of all, just to situate that discussion, you know, of course, that discussion takes place in the discussion of morality, right? In the latter part of the discussion of morality. There, I think the problem that the beautiful soul encounters is that what we today would call the problem of dirty hands. Yeah, you know, if I act just in virtue of acting, the question of what my real motives for action are going to necessarily arise. If I can refrain from action and just claim to know what moral reality consists in, what it is to be moral and to remain pure, right, then I can make good on my claim to be a bona fide member of the kingdom of ends. But I'm going to act, because otherwise, what are you really saying in saying that you're moral? Show us that you're moral. There's got to be evidence. And so he's going to act. And so now the question is going to rise about whether his motive is as pure as he claims it is. And so his beautiful soul is inevitably going to be compromised. And it's no accident that following the discussion of the beautiful soul, of course, as you know, is the introduction of the topic of evil.
So you would interpret that as one person?
So I would say that there's a moral interaction, right? There's the actor, there's the spectator, right? The spectator is now in a position to query the beautiful soul who's now engaged in the world morally, right? He's taken action. And to question whether he is, as he claims to be, namely purely moral. Yeah. And he has no way to establish the moral purity of his motive. And so what in the end keeps him from being ascribed as, in the end, evil? And hence the failure of morality as the privileged way of the self to establish its reality as all reality. Yeah, sorry.
I just wanna, I forgot the motivation, right? That's what happened at the end. The critique of modern science.
Yes.
Is modern science very good, but not good on the human things, or about the soul, but actually advanced? I think the way you put it is that it's advancing very well.
Yes, right,
But it's,
right. Yeah,
wise.
yeah,
I mean, that's the great authority in modern science, that there's an engagement with it, chemistry and biology,
Yeah.
physics.
yeah. Mhm.
But that's already non-metaphysical.
That's correct.
If that word means anything.
Yes, yes, yes,
Um,
yeah.
So what is he trying to do with respect to it? I mean, why is he
Yeah,
criticizing
okay, that's
science?
good. That's good. So, two things. Let me read a sentence, all right? Not from Hegel, because I'm really just cribbing Kant. Yeah, but I didn't want to require that anybody ever read a word of Kant in order to at least follow my line of reconstruction of this argument. So here's Kant, third paragraph, preface to the Prolegomena 20 Future Metaphysics, which will be able to come forward as science. And he uses that word metaphysics, right? So there's got to be a prolegomena, a preliminary study, in order to find out, right? So here's the third paragraph. My purpose, says Kant, is to persuade all those who think metaphysics worth studying that it is absolutely necessary to pause a moment and, regarding all that has been done as though undone, meaning never to have been done, to propose first the preliminary question whether such a thing as metaphysics can even be possible at all, right? So Hegel takes that seriously, I'm saying. That's what motivates him. So what I'm saying when I mention philosophies in crisis, I'm setting up a contrast, again, cribbing Kant, because we know that what he does almost immediately following in the Prolegomena is to tout the great successes of mathematical physics, right? So they don't have a problem, right? Why can't it be that philosophy likewise? That doesn't mean that he's saying, nor is it that I want to say, that there's competition for the same throne, right? Some people might say that, right? Some people might say, mathematical physics is trying to be metaphysics, right? To replace the old metaphysics. But it might be that mathematical physics provides a model of knowledge that says we can have knowledge, it just won't be metaphysics at all. But that's all right, because what do we need that for, right? To use the Lockean formula, let the philosophers be the under-laborers, yeah? Let them become analytic philosophers. Let them become philosophers of science, right? Yeah, we'll be doing the main thing. They'll be just, to put it in German, nachhinkend, yeah? Going along behind us, yeah? So it's this discrepancy between the apparent successes of mathematical physics on the one hand, and on the other hand, the absence of any kind of progress in the case of metaphysics, together with the philosophic skepticism saying, yeah, and that's symptomatic, right? What that really is showing is that it's not just that metaphysics is having some troubles getting its act together. It's got no act to perform, in fact. There's no there, right? Yeah. So Kant says, well, wait a minute, let's not close the door yet, but we need to engage in a preliminary study, a prolegomena, right? In order to determine once and for all whether in fact this is just Don Quixote theoretically at work. My point is that while Hegel accepts Kant's call to suspend business as usual in philosophy, he thinks that Kant, through what Kant calls transcendental philosophy, critique of pure reason, yeah, Kant's attempt at a prolegomena fails because it commits a gigantic petitio. Because by laying out an account of knowing, which will then allow him to get an angle on the impossibility of metaphysics, right? We're going to ask questions that we can't help but ask, but which we'll never be able to answer, right? He has himself failed to wall off his prolegomenon from the very thing that's under investigation. And so if you want to really find out once and for all whether metaphysics is possible, you cannot do it in the form of transcendental philosophy. You've got to go phenomenological. That's the only way to go. You've got to now conduct this thought experiment of a philosopher who supplies himself with all that he needs so that if he succeeds, he'll succeed by his own lights, so that no one else will have to introduce anything that would then be construable as smuggling in metaphysical premises. We're not going to do that. Yeah? And so if you want to do what Kant says we need to do, you got to go Socratic. It's got to be an elenchus. It's got to be, in effect, a kind of maieutic. Let's see whether he can give birth to a viable baby, right? Or whether each time it's going to be stillborn. You know? And my claim is that what absolute knowing has come to understand is that all of these births, unfortunately, have been stillborn. And hence Golgotha on the last page. You know? It's time to bury metaphysics.
So, does Hegel, in your reading, know that there is no God, or does he know that he'll never know?
That's a really fabulous question. How should I answer that? Here's what I'll say. For the moment, just restricting myself, just for the moment to the phenomenology, we know that in the encyclopedia outline and in his lectures on religion, which were, as all of those lectures that he gave once he became the reigning academic philosopher in Berlin during the decade 1820 to 1830, that the Berlin Hegel, who had such an influence on the young Hegelians, including Marx, on Kierkegaard, and others. Let's leave that aside just for a moment, the discussion of religion that he gave in his lectures based on the outline. If you just look at the phenomenology, the death of God is introduced into the argument in a very interesting place. If you look at this penultimate chapter titled Religion, it's in 3 parts. Hegel loves 3s, as we all know, right? But he never said anything about synthesis, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That was Fichte. But he likes 3s. But in the religion chapter, there are 3 sections, and the second section is titled The Religion of Art. And the religion of art culminates in a discussion, this is very interesting, of comedy. Of comedy. So he's thinking about Aristophanes. And the discussion of comedy culminates with the comic poet coming forward, facing the audience, and saying to the audience, you realize that this has all been made up. It's a fiction. Well, the comic poet had been talking about God, amongst other things. So I'm here to let you know, says the comic poet, that was all a joke. You know, God's dead. And by my announcing it, this was all just a poetic fiction, I'm in effect telling you, God's dead. Yeah. But interestingly, the philosopher, in his religious guise, does not end by coming forward as the comic poet, but rather goes on to announce a birth of a human being who is God. And since I am a human being, and I know myself, I, in effect, am God. So if I can make good on that claim, I'm God, the perfect metaphysician, then I'm home free. Yeah? And that's what the remainder of the religion chapter is designed to probe. Can consciousness, the philosopher, actually establish that he himself, in effect, is God? After all, the philosopher is with all of those other members of the community of the faithful who are happy to accept the idea that the death of God is really not the right way to look at what happened on Good Friday. There really was no death. There was a kind of ascension. And the resurrection simply is evidence that the death was really a kind of transcending of certain contingent features of God. And so the idea that I am God is falsified because I'm not God, I'm still alive, he's dead, is not dispositive. If I can achieve self-knowing in the way that God knows himself, so if I can know myself as God, then that's good enough to establish not only that God is, but I am that very God. And that's what Hegel says cannot be established. And that's the last, very last attempt on the part of the philosopher of consciousness to establish his claim to be the successful metaphysician.
I think we have time for one more
Yeah,
question.
yeah.
Lucas?
Yeah.
Something I feel like you alluded to in the beginning was that there is a difference between our ideas of reality and reality.
Yes.
What really is.
Yes.
So because the world is not made out of words, nor our conceptions of it,
Yeah.
to the metaphysician, would they say that the dichotomy between good and evil,
I'm sorry, lost the last part?
would they say that the dichotomy between good and evil is another social construct?
This goes back to, I mean, it's a very good question you're asking. It links up with your earlier question about the beautiful soul. So we're back to morality. I don't think that moral consciousness, engaged in moral action, is going to give up on the idea that there really is a difference between good and evil. That's not just for this aspiring metaphysician. That's not just a fiction or a falsehood. The problem for the moral agent is to demonstrate through his action that he really is, not just his action, right? But he himself is moral. rather than immoral, so that he really is morally good rather than morally evil. So he certainly has to take for granted that there is moral good and moral evil. And the question now is, does he embody it or not? And not just embody it in his action, but even in his motivation, in his intention. You know? And it's that claim that his motive is morally pure, not only his action, that is something that he needs to be able to prove is true and cannot.
Please join me in thanking Professor.